Suffering is that aspect of existence that occurs when reality is at odds with what we desire. Something such as a heartbreak triggered by a breakup or sudden death of a loved one can radically shake one's sense of reality and may even leave them disillusioned with their existence. And in pondering the collective suffering of humanity's past and present, with all the killing, all the division, all the wars, genocides, racism, sexism, you name it, leaves many wondering why a world that even allows such suffering would even exist at all, leading many to adopt a sort of pessimistic, nihilistic outlook on life. And if you yourself are going through some intense suffering, I don't want to take away from that with this video. Suffering can be brutal, so if you're going through something right now, I hear you, I'm here for you. And with this video, I just want to aid in the process of your healing and your development as a human, because suffering, it turns out, is a crucial and necessary component for growth. The reason I'm making this video is not to justify any suffering that is inflicted on others, but to bring awareness to the fundamental ego mechanisms on why we suffer and how that really it is only through hardship that we can learn anything at all, and thus be on our way to becoming a more conscious, loving, wholesome species, so that when we ourselves are in suffering, rather than running away from it, rather than denying it, we embrace it wholeheartedly so that we can integrate all of the lessons that the suffering has to offer us. So at a root level, we seek joy and pleasure and avoid pain and suffering because we live as a self. The self, which we can also call the ego, is the conceptual identity that exists within our minds. This ego is essentially the mind's operating program. It is the filter through which we interpret reality, and it is the mechanism that makes our lives meaningful and gives us a sense of permanence. Without it, we couldn't experience pleasure, which is when the ego's desires are fulfilled, and without it, we couldn't experience suffering, which is when reality is at odds with the ego's desires. And I like to think of the ego as being a stack of Jenga blocks. You can lose a few blocks here and there and still be standing strong, but eventually, when the block that the structure depends upon gets pulled, the whole thing comes crashing down, and all of a sudden, you are in deep suffering and turmoil. You feel broken. In some instances, you may call it heartbreak, and then you will beg and wish for things to go back to the way they were before. And while everyone has multiple blocks that threaten the foundation of this ego structure, I'm talking death of a loved one, your house burning down, going bankrupt, etc. For my younger teenage self, this experience of having my house of cards that is the ego collapse came from a high school girlfriend suddenly and unexpectedly breaking up with me. In my mind, I thought the relationship was going well, but one morning, over the phone, she basically said something like, "I'm not really feeling it anymore, let's just be friends." And in one sweeping instant, my heart just shattered. I remember the moment clearly. I was completely blindsided. In my mind, I thought she was the one. I saw the future with her, and just like that, the plan I had for my life just disintegrated. In a sense, this collapsing of the house of cards that is the ego is sort of like death in a way, because that thing that was so integral to your sense of self is now gone, and now you have to completely rebuild yourself around that. But I'm making this video to tell you that in your deepest sorrows and most brutal sufferings, that there is an opportunity to rebuild yourself into a much stronger, durable, more compassionate, and more wise person than ever before, because really, like I said earlier, it is only through suffering that we can grow at all. I remember shortly after the breakup, I just couldn't stop thinking to myself, why? Why would she do this? We were meant for each other. We were perfect for each other. How could she do this? And at first, I just couldn't accept to myself that this was now the reality, and so I fought it, denying it and trying to fix it, making it what I wanted. And so me being my naive teenage self that I was, I kept texting her, trying to convince her that we should still be together. But after doing this for some time, she blocked my number, and that's when I was sent into an even deeper spiral, thinking things like, I don't know how I'm going to live without her. She's my other half. And even after this, I still held out hope that we would end up together. But when she got a new boyfriend only like 2 months later, I had to finally accept the reality that we were not going to be together. And it was only when I accepted this reality that my healing could actually begin. And I still spent that entire school year, I think it was my junior year of high school, very depressed, as I had picked up core beliefs that I was weak, not man enough, and overall just a worthless human being. And the worst part was, because I was so depressed, was that I just thought This was the way I was, and for a while I had no motivation or drive to better myself in my situation, and during the peaks of my depression, I would experience suicidal ideation. It was not until near the end of that school year, so about 9 or 10 months or so after the breakup, that I was able to start putting myself and the relationship into a healthier perspective. At some point, I remember I was riding in the passenger seat, going through the mountains near Lake Tahoe, and I was scrolling Instagram, and I came upon a video with a hook that asked, "Are you in love, or are you just infatuated?" And essentially, this short little video described love as genuinely seeing and accepting and embracing the other person for who they truly are, not just what they can do for you, and infatuation as being a fantasy, a temporary and intense admiration for what a person can do for you and bring to your life. And at first I was like, nah, I wasn't just infatuated. I know love when I feel it. But over time, my mind just could not stop thinking about this distinction, and slowly but surely I started to take on the perspective that I could not say that I truly loved her in the relationship, because I accepted that what was really happening was that I was obsessed with and fixated on what she had been providing for me, which in reflecting I had realized was mainly a strong sense of self-worth. And so that was the core realization for me, that I was terribly reliant on others, especially romantic partners, in order to feel validated and whole, and that if I wanted to feel better in the long term, I had to develop a strong intrinsic sense of worth and had to start uncompromisingly working towards the things that mattered to me. I started dressing in a way that felt more authentic. I got into lifting weights. I started reading personal development books. I cultivated my interest in psychology, philosophy, spirituality, and politics. I explored altered states of consciousness, all of which inspired me to use my life to become a transformer of society. And while all of that change was far from night and day, it took a while. Now, several years later, I look back on that past self who needed validation so badly from romantic partners to feel whole. I look back on that past self as if he lived an entire lifetime ago. That's how drastic the change has been, and never again could I put so much energy into being shallowly validated by others. And it's not that I live completely free of this need, but my internal metric of success and the way in which I derive my self-worth has just shifted entirely. And I use the story of my high school heartbreak, even though most people are probably thinking, oh, it's just high school, it's just immaturity, and it doesn't matter. Still, this is an experience of completely having that house of cards that is the ego collapse. An experience of being so broken that you don't know how you can go on living your life. But now, several years later, I have so much gratitude in my heart for what happened, because without this intense suffering, I would have never experienced such a profound internal transformation, which has brought so much peace to my life. So I guess what I want to say here is that if you're heartbroken, if you're at rock bottom in some way, you just feel completely lost, not knowing if you'll ever be happy or stable again, maybe even contemplating ending your life, know that when you're in this state, that you're actually in a state of ripeness for changing your life for the better, because your house is broken, it's fallen apart, but now through feeling the suffering, self-reflecting, introspecting, and taking action, you have the opportunity to rebuild your house into a much greater house than ever before. And this is because there are 3 primary benefits to suffering, and that suffering increases resilience, compassion, and wisdom. This is true on an individual and a collective, cultural, societal level. A baby comes into the world kicking and crying and screaming at every minor inconvenience because the baby has not yet built resilience to suffering. And so a large aspect of child development is simply building that resilience to suffering, because minor inconveniences happen every day, and adult life will demand that you work through it and not get bogged down by it. And are you also aware of how young children can be very selfish? Young children can be major assholes because they have little to no capacity to take on the perspective of others. They have an impulse in their consciousness and they immediately want it gratified without a second thought about it. And so a major aspect of child development is being able to recognize their own suffering in other people so that they can start acting in more compassionate ways that do not make others suffer. So a leap in child development would be to share their toy with someone else, because they recognize that both want the toy and both will be sad if they don't have the toy. So in order for both of them to be happy, they need to share the toy together. And this ability to inhabit deeper and deeper perspectives is what all, and I repeat, all human development stems from. And then with this ability to inhabit various and more complex perspectives at once, we were able to make wiser decisions in accordance with the well-being of the greater whole. But no one is born fully developed. This development can only occur through suffering and hardship. Because think about it, if everything was perfect, if we had everything we ever wanted and we experienced no hardships, why would there be any reason at all to change? And the answer is pretty clear. There would be no reason to change. It is only through suffering that our beliefs, identity, ways of thinking, behaving, and relating to the world come into question. And now to talk about suffering on a more collective societal level, I find that many people fail to recognize how our entire species is standing upon the shoulders of giants who, as a result of suffering mightily, have learned lessons and transcended their old ways of thinking and relating to the world, so that you can be sitting here in the comfort of your own home, on your device that connects you to the entire world, without a single worry of where your next meal is coming from or who might be coming to invade your village. People take these things for granted. And the truth is that in present day 2023, humanity is living in the safest, most peaceful, well-off time in all of history, and it could be so much better too. We still have such a long way to go as a species, and if you don't believe me that this is the best time period, just feel free to go incarnate in your next life as any human prior to the year 1950, and that should clear things up. And I'm not saying life is easy today by any means. There's still lots of problems we have to fix. I'm coming from a privileged perspective in a more developed country, but the reality is that life in general is just very comfortable and more secure relative to other regions and time periods, and I'm calling people out that people take that for granted. And the reason that we have this life that is much more comfortable and secure than before is because people, our ancestors, have gone through incredible amounts of suffering and have learned lessons from it, so we can live better today. So to take a very quick and brief trip through the development of humanity here, a few thousand years ago, in a world that faced incessant tribal and factional warfare, it was primarily religion, especially monotheistic religion, the belief in an all-knowing and all-loving God that was able to unify all of these warring tribes and the suffering they had created and create a larger, more harmonious whole. And of course, most of us can see that this religion comes with a lot of problems, and it did. It caused new problems while it solved old problems, as it demanded conformity to its worldview, its values, its way of life. People were killed for being non-conforming, and it caused larger scale war and conflict. And eventually, after a couple thousand years, it was primarily science, rationality, and reason that made a stand against the massive amounts of suffering that was caused in the name of religion, and started to seek truth and understanding through the senses, through what can be observed through empirically verifiable evidence. And while this was great and helped end the rather dogmatic waves of mainstream religion, it was far from the end-all be-all. We still had a lot of problems, and now in the aftermath of the most brutal war in all of humanity's history, talking about World War II here, along with the realization of the repercussions that have come about through centuries of racism, sexism, classism, and nationalism, an entire new consciousness has been born from this. And this consciousness is world-centric, meaning that its area of concern is on a world stage. It's not just about someone's tribe or someone's nation or someone's small organization they identify with. They identify with the entire world. And this consciousness is defined by togetherness and harmony, seeks to liberate humanity from greed and dogma, create equal opportunity for all, and works towards the well-being of all life forms. Think about the 1960s counterculture movement, climate change activism, various social justice movements that have taken place, present-day liberalism, spiral dynamic stage green, if you're familiar with that model. And of course, this new awareness is relatively new. It still has a lot of immature expression in that it clashes with other worldviews and value systems. It looks down upon them and tries to impose upon them. So this new awareness creates many problems of its own. It's far from perfect, but this world-centric awareness is exactly what is needed to tackle the problems humanity faces in the present day, which is exactly why these types of awareness and these types of people have emerged. So I hope that you can see in this brief trip through the development of humanity that higher consciousness, like the world-centric one I just described, it emerges from the chaos created by lower consciousness, such as egocentric, ethnocentric, nation-centric, and religiocentric consciousness. It's only through inhabiting that perspective, that worldview, creating all these problems within that we can rise above that and come to a more world-centric awareness, that we can come to a greater level of unity, a greater level of harmony. And I emphasize once again, all of that can only happen through suffering and hardship. And so, to me, it seems that it is interwoven into the fabric of life that greater levels of peace, harmony, love, and intelligence lie on the other side of suffering. Again, in looking at history, I feel this is fairly obvious. My hope in making this clear to you is so that you are better able to take an optimistic approach towards suffering and maintain a growth mindset through the most difficult of hardships. Because when you do the opposite and double down on your defense mechanisms, deny reality, bury your traumas, and numb yourself with distractions and substances in order to escape reality, you're not only harming yourself further in this process, but you're also not able to integrate the lessons that need to be learned. Suffering occurs because you are in conflict with reality. And how do you ever expect to resolve this conflict if you deny, repress, distract, and numb yourself from its existence in the first place? These strategies of numbing and distracting yourself can be useful in the short term, but if you use them for too long, you become ripe for accumulating a mental illness and just developing a pessimistic, bitter outlook on life, which I'm sure no one watching this really wants to have. You know, if I kept blaming my ex-girlfriend for my suffering, and I did for a while, I would have never been able to become aware of my lack of self-worth and reliance on romantic partners in order to fill this void within me, and thus I never would have been able to rise above the level of consciousness that had created that internal conflict. So when you, my friend, are suffering, remember that you are on the training ground for your own self-transcendence. It is only through suffering that you can transcend the chaos created by one state of mind and move to a higher, healthier, more holistic one. So rather than running from suffering, become disillusioned by it, I encourage you to face it as wholeheartedly as you can. Do what you can to feel the suffering fully. Meditate and just feel the sensations of it. Contemplate, ask yourself questions in the midst of suffering like, what is the lesson here? Why am I reacting this way? What would love do right now? Do some stream of consciousness journaling, go to therapy, that would help a lot. Consider hiring a life coach, maybe that could be me. Check out my website to learn more on that. And just any other activity that increases awareness and mindfulness would be good for just feeling suffering fully until it exhausts itself so that you are through it and you've learned the lessons from it. So that's pretty much all I have to say today, guys. I hope this perspective on suffering and hardship and heartbreak was helpful, and that it helps you see that there is an underlying purpose, or rather process might be the better word, behind suffering, and that in the long run, suffering reveals the limitations of our individual and collective ego structures. You know, we go from a very narrow, constricted, egoic sense of self, and you suffer from the problems that that level of awareness creates, and then a newer, more expansive and holistic sense of self is born out of all the chaos that that creates. So I guess to finalize my perspective on suffering is that I see all suffering as part of the perfection of reality. And I don't hold this perspective all the time, because when I'm suffering myself and I'm trying to escape and deny reality, I fail to see the perfection behind it. But when I'm in a very deep, meditative, blissful state, I start to feel it a lot more, and there's just this knowing in my heart that it's all perfect. And when I say reality is perfect, I'm not saying that the way the outer external world should just stay that way. I'm saying everything in experience is perfect. It's meant to be there. That includes your own will that enacts itself onto reality to change it in the way that it best sees fit. Don't assume that just the world is just the outer world. The world, you are part of the world. Your inner experience is part of the world. Don't think of yourself as separate than that. So yeah, I think the reality is that humanity will continue to create suffering for thousands and thousands of years. It very well may take extraordinary catastrophes for our species to finally awaken out of the slumber we've been in for our entire existence. The ego is very short-sighted, and it often needs something really, really big to shock it out of its ways of operating. But on an individual level, we all have a choice to run away from, to deny, to escape suffering, or we can dive into it wholeheartedly, feel it fully until it exhausts itself, and thus learn the lessons that it has to offer. That's all I have for today, guys. If you resonate with what's being said here and would like some guidance in areas such as working through suffering, crafting your life vision, living your life vision, and cultivating mindfulness, I would highly recommend considering coaching calls with me. If this resonates with you, I'd head to the coaching tab of my website. The link will be in the description for that. And as always, guys, have a great day and peace.